Welcome back for the third time now. Tonight, we widen the circle a little. So far, we've met the child inside you, and we've practiced offering that child what they needed. Tonight, we go further back, because the patterns that shaped your inner child rarely began with your own childhood. They travel backward, further than that, through a long thread of parents and grandparents and ancestors, each one doing their best with what they inherited, each one passing something forward, sometimes without ever meaning to. This is not about blame. It never has been. This is about noticing the thread, gently, so that it can finally stop pulling tighter with every generation, and start, instead, to loosen. Let your body settle now into the bed beneath you. Let your breath slow. Before we begin, our small anchor, as always. If you'd like, in the comments below, write, "I am ready to break the cycle." Let this be your marker tonight, a quiet signal that you are willing to be the place where an old pattern finally stops traveling forward unexamined. Let your eyes close, let your shoulders drop. Tonight, we speak of inheritance, not of money or possessions, but of emotional patterns, old survival strategies, and the quiet work of becoming the one who finally interrupts what no longer needs to continue. Let's begin. Let us speak plainly about what psychologists and family therapists have come to understand about generational patterns, sometimes called intergenerational transmission, a formal term for something families have always known intuitively, that certain ways of coping, certain silences, certain fears seem to repeat themselves across generations, almost like a family recipe no one remembers choosing to follow. A parent who grew up in scarcity often raises children with a particular relationship to money, whether abundance or anxiety, regardless of their actual circumstances later in life. A parent who grew up needing to be quiet to keep a volatile household calm often raises children who learn, without ever being told directly, that their own voice is somehow dangerous. A parent who was never allowed to grieve openly often raises children who inherit the same difficulty, the same instinct to swallow sadness rather than let it be witnessed. None of this happens through any single dramatic lesson. It happens through atmosphere, through the tone of a household, the unspoken rules everyone somehow understood without being told, the small daily moments that taught, more powerfully than any lecture could, what was safe to feel and what needed to be hidden. I want to be careful here, because this teaching can easily slide into something it was never meant to be, a way of excusing harm or of flattening real accountability into vague talk of generational patterns that no one is responsible for. That is not what tonight is about. Real harm remains real harm, regardless of where it originated. But understanding where a pattern came from does something valuable alongside that accountability. It removes a particular kind of shame, the shame of believing something is uniquely, personally broken in you, when in fact you are carrying forward a strategy that once made sense somewhere further back in your family's history as a genuine response to genuine hardship. Consider, gently, a pattern you recognize in yourself that you also recognize, if you think about it, in a parent or a grandparent or further back still. Perhaps it's a particular anxiety around conflict. Perhaps it's a difficulty receiving help. Perhaps it's a tendency toward relentless self-sufficiency, learned by someone somewhere in your line who genuinely could not rely on anyone else and had to survive that way. You do not need to trace this pattern back with historical precision tonight. Most families don't have perfect records of exactly when and how a pattern began. What matters is simply recognizing that it began somewhere, with someone who was also, once, a child trying to survive their own particular circumstances, doing the best they knew how with what they had been given. I want to be careful here, because this teaching can easily slide into something it was never meant to be, a way of excusing harm or of flattening real accountability into vague talk of generational patterns that no one is responsible for. That is not what tonight is about. Real harm remains real harm, regardless of where it originated. But understanding where a pattern came from does something valuable alongside that accountability. It removes a particular kind of shame, the shame of believing something is uniquely, personally broken in you, when in fact you are carrying forward a strategy that once made sense somewhere further back in your family's history as a genuine response to genuine hardship. Consider, gently, a pattern you recognize in yourself that you also recognize, if you think about it, in a parent or a grandparent or further back still. Perhaps it's a particular anxiety around conflict. Perhaps it's a difficulty receiving help. Perhaps it's a tendency toward relentless self-sufficiency, learned by someone somewhere in your line who genuinely could not rely on anyone else and had to survive that way. You do not need to trace this pattern back with historical precision tonight. Most families don't have perfect records of exactly when and how a pattern began. What matters is simply recognizing that it began somewhere, with someone who was also, once, a child trying to survive their own particular circumstances, doing the best they knew how with what they had been given. I want to add one more piece of understanding before we move into tonight's practice. Something about how these patterns often hide in plain sight, disguised as simple personality traits rather than inherited survival strategies. Consider the difference between a trait that feels chosen, flexible, and available to you in some situations but not others, and a trait that feels automatic, rigid, and present regardless of whether the original danger it responds to is actually in the room. A person who is naturally cautious in genuinely risky situations is exercising judgment. A person who feels a flood of anxiety, even in situations that pose no real threat every single time without variation, is very often carrying forward an old pattern rather than responding freshly to the present moment. This distinction matters because it offers a way of recognizing, in ordinary daylight, when an inherited pattern has quietly taken the wheel. The question worth asking is not, is this trait good or bad, but rather, does this response fit the actual size of what's happening right now? Or does it feel like it's responding to something much older, much larger, that isn't actually present in this room? I want to mention too that these patterns are not always passed down through pain alone. Sometimes what's inherited is a narrowed sense of what's possible, a family belief absorbed early about how much joy, success, or ease a person like you is allowed to have. Even in families with real love and real care, a kind of quiet ceiling can be passed down, generation after generation, not through cruelty, but simply through nobody in the line ever having lived past that ceiling themselves, so nobody quite knew how to model what was possible beyond it. Consider, gently, whether any part of your own life feels capped in a way that doesn't fully make sense given your actual circumstances. A persistent difficulty allowing yourself more rest, more recognition, more ease than felt available to the people who raised you. This, too, is worth including in tonight's work, alongside the more obviously painful patterns we've already discussed. There is a phrase worth holding on to here, one used often in this kind of work. Hurt people, but healed people, heal people. This is not meant as a simple platitude. It is meant to point towards something genuinely hopeful. The same mechanism that carried pain forward, generation after generation, can also carry healing forward once someone, somewhere in the line, does the work of interrupting the pattern rather than passing it on unexamined. Tonight, you are being invited to be that person. Not because you are more broken than anyone who came before you, but because you happen to be the one, right now, with the awareness, the resources, and the willingness to look closely at what's being carried forward and to ask honestly whether it still needs to continue. Part 2. The Practice of Interruption. Let us begin a practice tonight designed specifically for this work, one that borrows from the visualization skills we built in our last night together, but applies them now to something wider than a single inner child, the lineage that child belongs to. I want you to picture, gently, a long line stretching behind you into the past. You do not need to know the specific faces of everyone in this line. Simply picture it as a line of figures stretching backward, each one connected to the next. Your parents and their parents, and further back still, generation after generation, further than memory or record can reach. Notice, without needing to judge or diagnose anyone in this line, that each figure was once a child too. Each one inherited something from the figures before them, some of it nourishing, some of it burdensome, most of it some complicated mixture of both. Each one did what they could with what they'd been given, in circumstances you likely know only partially, if at all. Now, I want you to imagine a particular pattern, the one you identified earlier, the anxiety, the difficulty receiving help, the relentless self-sufficiency, whatever it was for you, traveling along this line like a thread, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, each person adding their own particular strain to it before passing it forward. And now, see this thread arriving, finally at you. I want you to imagine holding this thread in your hands now, feeling its weight, its texture, whatever quality it carries in your imagination. You do not need to be angry at the thread, or at the hands that passed it to you. You only need to notice, clearly, this thread ends its old journey with me. I am not required to hand it forward exactly as I received it. Imagine now a way of transforming this thread before it continues onward, not erasing it entirely, because some threads carry real strength and real resilience alongside their burden, but examining it carefully and choosing what to keep and what to finally set down. If part of this thread is genuine strength, resourcefulness, adaptability, love expressed imperfectly but sincerely, imagine keeping that part, honoring it, letting it continue forward as a genuine gift rather than a burden. If part of this thread is old fear, old silence, old patterns that no longer serve anyone, imagine setting that part down now, gently at your feet, no longer carried forward, no longer passed to whoever comes next in your line. Whether that's a literal child or simply the version of yourself that continues to grow forward from this moment on. Let us pause here and offer a few affirmations directed at this whole lineage, past and future, gathered together in this moment.